Hi, I'm Rob, and I'd like to welcome you to this Raspberry Pi playlist on the Cumulus Cycles channel. In this Getting Started video, I'll walk you through the Raspberry Pi microprocessor, some peripheral devices, and show you how to install the Raspberry Pi OS on a micro SD card using an M1 Mac. Now, some of you may have caught on to the fact that I called the Raspberry Pi a microprocessor and not a microcontroller. And that's correct. A Raspberry Pi is an actual single board computer versus a microcontroller such as an Arduino. If you'd like to take a deep dive into the differences between the Raspberry Pi and Arduino boards, I'll post a link to an excellent article in the description below. Now, let's take a look at the Raspberry Pi itself. As you can see, it comes with a choice of 1, 2, or 4 gig of RAM, and for this series, I'll be using a model with 4 gig. On board, there's a gigabit Ethernet port, 2 USB 2 and 2 USB 3 USB ports, 2 micro HDMI ports, and a USB-C power supply port. At the top of the board, you'll find a 40-pin GPIO header, and under that, the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth module. And in the center of the board are the CPU and RAM modules. And underneath is the micro SD card reader. Before we can use our Raspberry Pi, we need to install the Raspberry Pi OS on the SD card. To install the Raspberry Pi OS on the micro SD card, I'll start out by going to the raspberrypi.com/software webpage and then downloading the Raspberry Pi Imager for macOS. Now I'll insert the micro SD card into the card reader in my Mac. And then launch the downloaded DMG file for the imager. I'll drag the imager to the applications folder and then launch the imager. From the imager, I'll choose the OS and I'll select the first option for the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. Then I'll click Choose Storage, select the SD card. Next, I'll click the gear icon to launch the Advanced Configuration Options screen. Here, I'll leave the default hostname as raspberrypi.local and then click to enable SSH, which will allow me to remotely connect to my Raspberry Pi from my Mac in a headless mode. I'll add a new username and a password for my Pi user, and then click to configure wireless LAN. For SSID, I'll choose my network, and then enter my Wi-Fi password. The locale settings look good, so I'll click Save, and then Write. Alright, and now the Raspberry Pi OS has been written to the SD card. So I'll click Continue, and then eject the SD card from the card reader on my Mac and plug it into the Raspberry Pi. Now, when it comes to using the Pi, you could just leave it on your desktop, plug your devices into it, and go to town, or you could put it inside of an enclosure. I've purchased an enclosure kit, which I'll go ahead and assemble now, and then get back to you when that's complete. I'll also include a link to the assembly video in the description below if you're interested. Now, with the Raspberry Pi enclosed in the case, I'll go ahead and connect the keyboard to the Pi, the mouse to the keyboard, and then the Pi to an external monitor using the HDMI cable. And finally, I'll connect the power supply to boot the Raspberry Pi. The Pi will go through several boot sequences to complete configuration. And when the desktop is launched, we can open a web browser and visit the Raspberry Pi site. Now, when I configured my Pi, I selected to enable SSH so I could connect to the Pi from my Mac. This will allow me to interact with the Pi without having to log on using the mouse, keyboard, and external monitor that I previously connected to the Raspberry Pi. So, to connect to the Pi via SSH, I'll launch a terminal on my Mac and first see if I could reach the Pi over the network. And to do that, I'll execute a ping command against the default host name on the Pi, which is raspberrypi.local. And these responses tell me that I'm able to find the Pi on the network. So now, I'll issue an SSH command to connect to the Pi using my username at raspberrypi.local. This will prompt me to confirm that I want to add the key for the fingerprint, so I'll go ahead and say yes, and then enter my username's password. And now I'm connected to my Raspberry Pi. From here, I'll enter the command sudo su hyphen to elevate my privileges to the root user. Then, in order to connect to the Raspberry Pi using VNC, I'll go ahead and launch the Raspberry configuration by executing raspi-config. From here, I'll select Interface Options, then VNC, then select Yes to enable the VNC server. Now, under Display Options, I'll select the VNC resolution and select the maximum resolution. Finally, under System Options, I'll select Boot Auto Login and then select the Desktop option for the desktop GUI requiring user to log in. Now I'll finish and allow the Pi to reboot. Now, in order to connect to the Pi using VNC, I'll download the free Real VNC player from realvnc.com. So since I'm on a Mac OS, I'll download the VNC viewer's DMG file. Then I'll click to launch the DMG and drag the VNC viewer icon into the Applications folder. Now I'll launch the VNC viewer. From here, I need to enter the IP address to connect to the Raspberry Pi. So to do that, I'll jump back into the terminal, SSH into the Pi again now that it's rebooted, elevate my privileges, and then execute hostname -i to get the IP address. From here, I'll copy the IP, jump back in the VNC viewer, paste in the address, and then connect. I'll enter my username and password and click OK. And now I'm at the user login screen on the Raspberry Pi, where I can log in. And now I've successfully logged into the Raspberry Pi using a VNC connection from my Mac. So that concludes this Raspberry Pi Getting Started video. If you found this information helpful, feel free to give the video a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to this playlist, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I'll release more Raspberry Pi videos soon, so I hope to see you back here. Thanks for watching.